Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out for this event on Japan in the Indian Ocean region today, and braving the rains and the weather that has been DC the last 1 week. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace this Friday morning to talk about how Japan in the Indian Ocean and how does that strengthen Japan's relationships as well as its priorities across its Indo-Pacific strategies. Just to provide a little bit of context before I introduce our excellent speakers this morning, this is part of some of the ongoing work that we have been doing at the Carnegie Endowment on the Indian Ocean region and looking at different players who perhaps we don't think of or we don't frame as an Indian Ocean player, but definitely has a lot of engagements, interactions, priorities, and interest across that area. So it's part of that reframing, redebating, and having that conversation to really look at what is happening on the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, but not also just in the silo of the Indian Ocean, but how it impacts the larger conversations across the Indo-Pacific. And Japan is certainly an Indo-Pacific player and a power. Japan is a member of the Quad, a coalition between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And of course, it has a very strong alliance with the United States. It is also one of the very few countries who includes and defines the entire Indian Ocean region, including the eastern coast of Africa and its Indo-Pacific framing and strategy in a way that many others don't, like United States doesn't. Yet Japan is rarely discussed as an Indian Ocean player. So today we are looking at where does the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific fit within Japan's priorities, and more importantly, is there space and value in reframing Japan's Indian Ocean engagements to better reflect the importance of the region? To help us break down some of these questions, I'm absolutely delighted to have with us today two exceptional scholars and thinkers whose work I follow very closely and learn from, Dr. Ken Jimbo to my right and Dr. Zack Cooper to my other right. I'll just briefly introduce both, Washington, D.C. is not unfamiliar with either of them, but also particularly thank you, Ken, for flying out from Tokyo overnight and for joining us to do this in person. Absolutely delighted to have you here and very, very grateful for your time and thoughts. Dr. Ken Jimbo is the Managing Director of Programs at the International House of Japan in Tokyo, as well as a Professor of International Relations at Keio University. Ken served as a Special Advisor to the Minister of Defense, Japan Ministry of Defense in 2020, and was the Senior Advisor to the National Security Secretariat between 2018 and 2020. Dr. Zack Cooper, who's at the AEI right next door, is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies U.S. strategy in Asia, including alliance dynamics and U.S.-China competition. He also teaches at Princeton University and serves as a chair of the board of the Open Technology Fund. Currently, Zack is writing a book for Yale University Press that explains how militaries change during power shifts. Thank you both again for joining us this morning and helping us talk about this and bring different perspectives on how Washington should also be perhaps looking at the Indian Ocean as well as on Japan. Just quickly noting that this definitely is a good morning to be talking about Japan with developments back in Tokyo, changes in leadership. So thank you. The timing is right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I will perhaps turn to you, Ken, first to offer some opening remarks and thoughts, and then to you, Zack, and we'll have a moderated conversation, and then I'll open it up for the audience in the room.
Thank you, Darshana. And is my call?
Yes, I think.
I'd like to begin by thanking Darshana, Zack, Carnegie for inviting me to this wonderful conference. And I also really appreciate Darshana's consistent and key interest on the maritime security in the Indo-Pacific and the project. Let me do this again. I'd like to begin by thanking Darshana, Zack, for inviting me to this wonderful event. and Darshana's consistent keen interest on the Indo-Pacific and also launching on the projects on the Japan's interest in the Indo-Pacific and also in the Indian Ocean has been quite encouraging to highlight the recent, I think, developments of the Japanese strategic reorientation that has been taking place in the past decade or so. And also, thanks for highlighting this very critical period of time in the Japanese politics. It's only like 4 or 5 hours ago that the party election has resulted in selecting the new leader of the LDP, whose name is Shigeru Ishiba, former defense minister. It has been his 5 attempts to run for this presidency, and he finally got the seat to be the prime minister. And it will take place at the parliamentary session, probably in October 1st, and the new lineup of the minister will come up. So it will be nice to, take on this issue later. But starting from the Darshana's agenda, what has been the Japan's engagement in the Indian Ocean? And as you are well aware, while the Indian Ocean was not the primary, focus of the Japan's foreign defense policy, in traditional sense, that Japan focused on neighboring states and also over the Pacific, but it has become, significantly important with interconnected, agendas that Japan is now trying to engage. You can find those from the economic security, energy perspective, but more also in the maritime security and the strategic domain that the Japan is now increasingly value the Indian Ocean region as a strategic theater. And I think that this has come from the historical perspective, first of all. I think that it is important to recognize the Indian Ocean's critical role in Japan's economic security. Since it's over 80% of Japan's crude oil imports pass through the Indian Ocean, and it is the critical lifeline for Japan's energy security. And the Indian Ocean is not all about the oil, but this sea lanes connects Japan with critical markets in Europe, Middle East, and also in Africa. So it is the maritime corridor, which is essential for the Japan's, especially the business activities. And that really reflects on the Japan's recent development of the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. That has been officialized since 2016, but the initial concept has already been given a rise in the early dates of the first Abe administration. And it begins with engagement in India through the expanse of the business relationship and the rise of India, as emerging states. And according to the many of those, indicators for the prospect of the future of the economic developments, India will become the world number 3 economies in the decades to come. And those kind of new economic dynamisms need to be incorporated in the wider Japanese business activities, and that comes with the critical reason that why Japan needs to engage more multidimensionally to this region. And if you go beyond India, that's Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, through the infrastructure developments, capacity building, and also the development of the trade partnerships. And then those are the very much important perspective to create the region-wide engagement in the Indian Ocean. And you can particularly focus on the Japan's increasing agenda in developing the port projects, for example, in Sri Lanka, India, and also in Bangladesh, and having I think the particularly important to build the important nodes in the global supply chain through Indian Ocean. And you can see that those kind of particular interest has been made on the Colombo West projects in Sri Lanka and several others in the in the maritime connectivities in those areas. And also you can see that there has been the very interesting new efforts have been going on, particularly in Sri Lanka. After Sri Lanka experienced the debt crisis, Japan has partnered with India and interesting with France over coordinating the restructuring debt agenda in Sri Lanka, and they came up with a common platform to be agreed with the Sri Lanka government for the process of those kind of relationships. So those are the kind of new dynamics of the regional cooperation that is also contributing to the economic order agenda in South Asia region as well. And let me turn into the defense and maritime security agenda as well. It also has a very interesting sequence of the history. I think it begins with the self-defense force, maritime presence for the refueling missions to the coalition forces in the global war and terrorism when the coalition forces engage in the operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. Self-defense force has had the regular types of the routines of the supplying fuels to support the coalition forces, and that really created the Japan's maritime self-defense force activities geographical map to the Indian Ocean as a regular basis. And also, it has also participated in the anti-piracy operation off the coast of Somalia under the scheme of the Combined Task Force 151 based in Bahrain. And that is also one of the key agenda for the Japan's international contribution at the sea, also based in Indian Ocean. But I think in the recent 1 or 2 decades, there has been a particular emphasis has embedded in the Japan's, attempts to integrate its operation in the architecture of the security cooperation among those Indo-Indian Ocean states, starting from participating in the US-India Malabar in 2006. And recently, there's a Karat exercise that has been taking place between the United States and Sri Lanka. And Japan also signed in as one of the partner to be in. So that there has been a more presence of the Japanese naval forces in the Indian Ocean at the regular basis that also become the more institutionalized in a way that those kind of regular meal-to-meal exercise has now also taken place. And I think we'll come back to the Quad agenda later, but I think these are the growing, strategic importance of the Japanese security strategy agenda, which also creates the kind of Indian Ocean region as one of the primary theaters in the Japanese defense and security policy, and that has been coined by the emerging potential as the economic player, starting from India, but the whole South Asian regions as well. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ken. Zack, if I could turn to you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Darshana. Darshana has been such a leader on maritime issues across the whole region, but particularly on the Indian Ocean. And as we were saying in the green room, one of the few people that has actually worked and lived in Japan, in Australia, in India, and in the United States. So really has a unique ability to bring together those different countries. And Ken, always wonderful to be with you, especially on a day when we have a new prime minister named in Japan. So I think what we're seeing from the United States and the Indian Ocean is clearly an increase in effort, and we're doing that alongside Japan and Australia and a number of other partners. But I want to make just two perhaps counterintuitive points about this before I hand it back to you, Darshana. So the first is that the United States has a challenge. Mm-hmm. We have said that we want to prioritize the Indo-Pacific region. And with Japan's good guidance here, we've adopted the free and open Indo-Pacific terminology. But the reality is the United States is stretched globally. As we all know, there's a war ongoing in Ukraine that doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. There's the ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza, and now Lebanon as well. There is the challenge that the United States faces in all of the East Asia littoral region, whether it's Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, or South China Sea. And now we have the Indian Ocean. And so I think the United States has a bit of a challenge here, which is how can we devote enough attention to all of these regions? And certainly we have been trying to pivot from other regions to the Indo-Pacific for a number of years, but it's been a challenge. Yeah. And so I think one possibility is that the US will have to prioritize not just across regions and make the Indo-Pacific a priority, but also prioritize within the Indo-Pacific itself. And here, my guess is that the Indian Ocean is going to be an important part of American strategy, but maybe not as critical as people might have expected. And the reason, in part, is because India is stepping up in the Indian Ocean, and Japan is doing a lot more quietly with India and others in the Indian Ocean as well. So just the first part is, although we have an Indo-Pacific strategy, and we really are doing a lot more with India, and I think everybody is excited about the US-India bilateral relationship, it doesn't necessarily mean that the focus of our cooperation is going to be in the Indian Ocean from an American standpoint. And in fact, would be my second point, it's possible that Japan will be more critical in the Indian Ocean in some ways than the United States. The reason I say this is, if you think about India's position as a rising power, you know, I spent a little bit of time on history, and as both of you know, the United States was not particularly interested in having foreign powers meddling in its region as it was rising. And I think it's possible that India will look to cooperate with the United States and Japan and others, but will want a little bit of room to grow in the Indian Ocean. And therefore, there are times that the United States may be offering cooperation to India that actually India may not take Washington up on that offer. But Tokyo is an easier partner in some ways. There's no question about whether the United States or Tokyo is going to be engaged with India, but from an Indian perspective, perhaps it's easier to partner with Japan, who you know isn't trying to create some sort of sphere of influence in the Indian Ocean, than it is with Washington. And I want to be clear here, I think from an American point of view, Washington mostly is trying to support India and pursue shared objectives. But as a rising power, it's natural for India to maybe preference countries that are going to be able to contribute to India's role in the region, but not try and supplant it in any way, even potentially, even if American leaders are being clear that that's not what they're trying to do. And so that leads me to think that actually Japan's role in the Indian Ocean could be more important, not just for Japan and India than people might think, but also for the United States. Because there may be things that we, from a US-Japan alliance perspective, would like to be able to do in the Indian Ocean that Washington won't be able to do, either because it's going to be resource constrained or because India might not be so comfortable with that American approach. So I think this is such a critical discussion to have, and Darshana, I'm glad that you've triggered more focus on this issue here in Washington.
No, thank you both. Thank you so much. And great sets of sort of remarks and some key points that have come out. And Zack, one of the points for having a project or a discussion on Japan and the Indian Ocean was essentially to bring forward this whole idea that, traditionally we have thought of few players that dominate the Indian Ocean region. So you think India, you think US, you think United Kingdom, and really to see, is that really true even now, or is there space, or there's others who are doing a lot more? So I think I agree with you that Japan is going to be a critical player in the Indian Ocean region generally for the United States, but also just for the region. And the other thing with Japan is, I think, it's of course is one of the most important investment partner, development partner for many across the region. And its engagement with Africa is actually quite consistent than many other countries who have an Indo-Pacific policy or a strategy would say so, even more than India, I would say, in terms of the presence across there and the engagement. So the way I see it in Indian Ocean conversation that, Japan's role in the Indian Ocean is actually easier to be defined than for many other countries. It's just, we don't hear about it. And maybe that's a message to Tokyo that, there is space and there is room to talk more about that and how that could actually help the Indo-Pacific priorities and the alliance itself. I just wanted to maybe pick on some of the things or pull out some of the points that the two of you have raised. And one of that is placing, it's obvious that the Indian Ocean is important to both United States and Japan. And there's a recognition both in Washington and in Tokyo in that. Where would you place the Indian Ocean within the alliance itself in terms of the larger developments in the Indo-Pacific? Is that whether it is, and I don't mean where does the Indian Ocean fit in, but essentially what kind of an environment would perhaps be viable, but also whether we're talking Taiwan Strait or whether we're talking South China Sea, whether we're talking the competition with China, where does the Indian Ocean play in the strategic sort of management of the alliance itself?
Sure. As many of you are aware, that Japan has gone through the major strategic realignment through the release of the strategic document in December 2022 that emphasized Japan's commitment for the fundamentally reinforce the capability of the self-defense force and double the size of defense budget. And that creates the more capacity to align with the U.S. Strategy to engage in the Western Pacific primarily. So we are looking at China, we are looking at the potential conflict in Taiwan, increasingly concerned about the situation in Korean Peninsula, and then the realignments among those China, Russia, North Korea entanglement in the region. Those are the primary, I think, concerns that the United States and Japan are now strategically coordinate itself. But it doesn't really mean that the Indian Ocean has been the secondary concerns for us, because as I mentioned, that Indian Ocean represents the critical sea lanes of communication for both Japan and the United States. And where United States still remains to be the dominant, I think, player in securing those slots, and by having an access to the Diego Garcia, and you have the place in the Bahrains and also in Djibouti, those kind of forward deployment capacity whenever it comes to the case that the United States needs to come in. Although Zack correctly mentioned that there should be the zero-sum type of the resource constraints always factored into the Indian Ocean. But whenever U.S. decides to come in, and that is the dominant player who can really, creates the stabilization roles. And I think Japan's role is to how to maintain that kind of perceptions among those kind of potential adversary who can really disrupt the situation. So I think regular exercises, institutionalizing of the security relationship, and then also committing ourselves in the like a defense industry cooperation, so that we are having a more like interface in those interoperable relationship with each other. Very glad to see that the recent development between India and the United States over the defense industry cooperation. The engine will be jointly built between U.S. and India. So as India provides the kind of repairing capacity for the U.S. naval vessels. And those are the great developments that, both sides will be more interdependent over what they want to achieve in the, Indian Ocean. So these are something that, allied perspective can fit into those perspectives.
Well, thank you.
I would just build on what Ken just said and note that, from an American perspective, the Indian Ocean is literally the other side of the world. If you were to draw a point from Washington, D.C. and go all the way as far as you can away from Washington, it puts you into the Indian Ocean down near Australia. And in fact, it's not easy for the United States to project military power that deep into the Indian Ocean as a result. Now, we are doing things to alter our ability to maintain forces, both through aircraft in mostly northern Australia and also through what's called the first phase of the AUKUS arrangement, which is to put a number of American nuclear-powered attack submarines in Perth in Australia. So the US is increasing its posture to some degree, but I think the reality is that many of those forces, they're not necessarily focused on the Indian Ocean. They're focused on being able to flow to the north if they're needed, into the South China Sea, into the Taiwan Strait, into the East China Sea, and to help bolster American presence in those regions. So I think for the United States, in terms of the maritime domain, we're probably most worried about, the, let's say, Taiwan Strait first, South China Sea second, East China Sea third, and then the Indian Ocean. So we would love it if our partners and allies could sort of handle security to some degree in the Indian Ocean without so much US involvement. Now, is the US willing to participate? Would we like to do exercises? Do we want to have good relations with all the countries along the Indian Ocean rim? Of course. But as a level of effort, I think the US hope is that perhaps we can play a supporting role to our friends in the region. And I think that's probably what's going to play out the next few years. Let me just add one caveat, though, which is if we saw China really increase its presence in the Indian Ocean very substantially. So you could imagine a world in which the Chinese had access to major port facilities in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, and also on the African coastline. In that world, I think you would see an increased American presence in the Indian Ocean, but we would probably have to rely a huge amount on what India was doing in the region, but also on Japanese investment in some Indian facilities, which has been going on quietly. So I think that sort of cooperation is going to be critical and only more important if China increases the level of its engagement.
No, absolutely. I want to stay on that point in terms of, that things could change if we see significant increase in Chinese engagements or presence, or I suppose capabilities, right? One of the things with the Indian Ocean in my work that I find, a little problematic is the way we define the Indian Ocean region, that, because we see it as developments under Africa or Middle East, sometimes those developments don't translate into the maritime advantages when these developments come up. For instance, when Djibouti came up, it was an Africa development, right? Like it wasn't an Indian Ocean development. So I think there's those mental blocks around it. And I think China has moved from talking about if we should have another base in the Indian Ocean to where should we have a base in the Indian Ocean region, right? So I think we have moved from if to when. Plus, I would say their engagement has been pretty consistent in terms of in 5-year periods, if you look at it. So you have the task force going out to Horn of Africa for anti-piracy missions in 2008. 2014, you saw the first submarines being deployed into the Indian Ocean region. 2017, a military base came up. So I do see 5-6-year layers of sort of increased engagements. But even in Delhi, when the submarines went out in 2014 and they docked in sort of Sri Lanka, the hope and the conversation in the region was that, it's not going to increase. We're not going to see an increase because they're not going to have the capacity. They're not going to be able to sustain it. And they'll be so drawn back by what's happening in the South China Sea that they won't have the capacity. But that's not true. I mean, the opposite has happened. Now you have consistent Chinese submarines in the Indian Ocean region, maybe not at massive numbers, but there is always submarines in the Indian Ocean region. So to ask maybe more directly, if there is another military facility that comes up in the Indian Ocean region, and say it's not in the Eastern Indian Ocean, say it's on the African coast, another one that comes up, plus it is combined with, say, more presence in submarines across the Indian Ocean region, and which is my sort of trend analysis, that we're going to see the Chinese aircraft carrier come through the Indian Ocean region in the next 2 to 3 years timeline. What would that mean for America's thinking, priorities, calculations? And similar to you, same question to you, Ken, what would that mean for Japan? Because I don't think so these scenarios are anymore future scenarios. I think we're talking about a 5-year timeline. So are there enough conversations in Washington and Tokyo that even considers these conversations and calculations?
well, maybe I'll offer an American perspective and then look to Ken for a Japanese view. So my view is that the United States is concerned about Chinese actions in the Indian Ocean, and therefore is going to adjust its engagement to some degree to match what China is doing there. And I think you're broadly correct that, look, at the end of the day, China may not have long been a maritime state, but rising powers tend to build large navies. They don't always know exactly why they're building large navies. You know, you could look back at Imperial Germany, among others. It doesn't always make good sense for them, but this is what rising powers tend to do. They tend to build large navies and to use them to project power abroad. So I think we should expect that China is going to continue with its building projects on the naval shipbuilding side. They're going to go further afield, both further into the Pacific, but also more into the Indian Ocean. And that's going to require basing access because you just can't operate without access to some number of facilities. So I hope our expectation on the government sides is that this is what we're going to see from Beijing. Now, I think there are two different ways to look at this from Washington. One view is that this is a threat and sort of anywhere China is, we need to be. The other way is that if the US and China have a significant contingency, the core of that contingency, it's not going to be in the Indian Ocean. Now, don't get me wrong, the United States might have to do some sort of peripheral campaign in the Indian Ocean and potentially cutting off some access to shipping and energy that flows through the Indian Ocean could be an operation that would be of interest to the American side in that kind of contingency. But the locus of that conflict initially, it's probably Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, East China Sea. And you know what? If you had Chinese ships that couldn't get back into that region in a contingency and were stuck in the Indian Ocean that couldn't go through the Malacca Strait or the Sunda or Lombok Straits, that's not necessarily a bad thing from an American perspective. But I think the knee-jerk reaction is going to be to say, anywhere China is, we've got to be and we've got to engage more. So we'll have to see what the balance is between those two approaches. And my guess, as with most policymaking, is we're going to get something right down the middle.
I share the perspective with Zack, and definitely we are all concerned about what the Chinese military buildups and deep engagement in the global affairs might mean for the strategy that we want to pursue. China recently tested the ICBM, and they actually fly over the Pacific Ocean. We know that China's developing the long-range missiles, and that they are developing more nuclear weapons. But with a demonstration of those kind of acts may really create a kind of strategic notion what kind of escalation management that the China wish to pursue. Same in the South China Sea. They have already reclaimed the 7 artificial islands, starting to militarize it. If they try to have a regular kind of stationing of the bombers and also the fighters, and if they really dominate kind of air superiority in that fields, and they're ready to kind of operate the bombing operation to the choke points like Malacca Strait, Lombok Straits. And they also have new developments in Cambodia over the naval stationing. We don't know the character yet, but seemingly that has been a minor but a very important step that they are interested in the foreign kind of access bases to be, I think, expanded to the Indian Ocean as well. And that might change the whole kind of configuration, what China can constrain United States and allies' effort to engage in the region. Whenever the crisis happen and then that is escalate, we have a menu to deal with it, but China will have a more menu to constrain those operations. So I do agree with Zack that whenever China thinks that this is a core interest to be defended, they have every efforts to put those kind of resources into that agenda. Now comes to the Indian Ocean. I think that the Chinese core interests may be, less prioritized in a way, but it is the same that the China also relies their energy access to the Middle East, and then there are sea lanes of communication need not to, definitely they have a wish to be not to be denied by the Western forces. So they have enough reason to have their own kind of access spaces that they can really secure their sea lanes of communication by itself. So that competition still goes on, but how critically it will go on to the next level of the confrontation, there should be a more kind of red zone you can identify in the Western Pacific rather than in the Indian Ocean.
No, absolutely. I actually don't think we would see any form of sort of confrontation outside of possibly India and China in the Indian Ocean to actually happen in there. I think the competition would actually get accentuated there because every time China does something more, it's going to be watched. And you're right, Zach, that it's going to come back to, should we be there? Should we follow China everywhere China goes, or how do we manage it? And how does any of these countries really manage the budget and resource constraints, which is really significant. And the one thing about Indian Ocean, it's vast. It's really vast, and major pockets of the Indian Ocean remain ungoverned. It's nobody's jurisdiction. It's nobody's responsibility. So you have ungoverned spaces for all sorts of illicit and illegal activities. Let me come to in terms of, so the one thing that I'm pulling out of this is also clearly both Tokyo and Washington will and already do depend on partnerships, right, to address its Indian Ocean concerns and interests. And perhaps at this point, Tokyo has more dependency in the Indian Ocean because of energy lines than the United States. The United States is more, like you said, I think, for its access to the continental subregions around the area. So it's obvious it's India is one of the key partners that both countries identifies. But just to be sort of maybe a little provocative on that is that, I mean, the Indian Navy is also the least funded arm of the sort of, the Indian military. And it has two nuclear powers, Pakistan and China, sitting on its continental borders, both of whom India has gone to war with. And there's a consistent contest to the point that you've had Indian soldiers die from confrontation with China. So given India is actually amongst the Quad nations also, is the one who is engaged and embroiled in physical confrontation with China along its continental borders, how realistic is it for Tokyo and Washington to depend on, rely on that partnership to be managed in the Indian Ocean? And second, who are the other partners within the Indo-Pacific conversation can either maybe start having conversations with to address some of those issues? Yeah.
That's a great point. And I think United States and Japan is quite open about, expanding the cooperation with India. But I think that we do not really have the illusion that India could be fully partner with the US-Japan alliance context in order to counter China, in order to deal with full strategic competition with China in a comprehensive manner. As we know that India is a multifaceted player pursuing their own version of the strategic autonomy. And whenever that strategic autonomy concept comes up with partnering with us, we are very happy to expand that arena. But we are not always same on every subject that we face. And that is, I think, at the baseline of where we are. But in the case of the maritime cooperation, I think that, as we engage in the different parts of the world, for example, the Quad Cooperation always focus on the maritime security, and we do like, regular exercise together. But by design of the operation is not about we get together all the time. But I think that we, set the standards of the maritime security, maritime domain awareness, and also what has been the rule-based maritime order should look like jointly address to the actors who really take the coercive action towards the maritime order. Those are great kind of platform we share with it. And I think India has been the dominant player. Whenever we coordinate the policy towards the Indian Ocean. But at the same time, interestingly, Japan has been focusing upon the new policy agenda called the Official Security Assistance. This is the ODA, kind of version to be those kind of the development funds to be provided to the end user of the militaries, so that we are able to fund directly to the capacity building of the foreign military forces, and also those with facilities associated with it. And the Bangladesh was one of the key kind of recipients of this scheme. And also we are expanding those the confidence building types of the interface with Sri Lanka as well. So I think that those kind of the middle ground player in the Indian Ocean have become a very important kind of balancing actor to provide the kind of I think the order, which is, we definitely need to have those rule-based international order conducive with Western kind of practices of the politics and the businesses. And I think that those Indian Ocean, political development defines to be a very important kind of agenda to be managed.
Thank you.
I would just add two thoughts. So first, I think you raise this really critical tension about whether India should focus on its land borders where it has real challenges, right? Border disputes with China, of course, and with Pakistan. And the new government in Bangladesh is going to, I think, have a more tricky relationship potentially with Delhi. Or look at the maritime domain. And I would just say, I think if you look back at countries like India as they continue to rise, you see that they tend to do both. Now, you could make an argument that India could probably de-emphasize maritime domain and naval forces, and there's some logic to that, but when countries get to be rising powers, they like to do what other rising powers have done before them, and that looks like aircraft carriers, it looks like surface action groups that can go a great distance. Sometimes it looks like overseas base access. And so I think India will follow that path more quickly than people would think if you just look back at Indian history. And the best example for that might be China, right? If you went back a couple of decades and you said to folks that China was going to be operating a larger navy that it's built in the last decade than basically the United States has total, that would have been pretty hard to imagine. And yet that's exactly what Beijing has done. And so I think we should expect that India will follow that pathway. Now, how quickly does it follow that path? That's certainly open for debate. The second comment I would make is, as Ken was saying, the rest of the region from an American point of view is critical, right? We're not just going to engage with India and South Asia, we're going to engage with other critical players, and there are a lot of important players. I do think the challenge here, though, is a resourcing challenge for Washington, which is that we can't engage deeply everywhere and devote resources everywhere. And this maybe is where the Quad is going to be critical. You've got 4 countries that all have a shared interest, not just in the Indian Ocean, but in the region more broadly. And they all have different engagement with some of the players. Some countries have tough relations with some of the Indian Ocean region, others do not. And so I think we're going to have to figure out a little bit of a division of labor. Of course, we're going to engage with every country across the region, but the level of engagement may be different across those partners. And within the Quad, I think one of the next discussions that we should be having is which country in the Quad is really going to take the lead on, say, one of the African bordering states on the Indian Ocean. The US can't be everywhere, so we'll have to divide and try and make sure that we've got the core countries resourced properly and are giving them the attention they're due.
Absolutely, and just coming out of the Quad Summit, which is already pretty full, and I think the agenda is pretty strong. 5 years ago, we were all asking what is Quad going to do. I think Quad's got a lot on their agenda, but the division of labor, I think, Zach, that's a really important point, because I think that's what it'll come down to ultimately between partners and players. And beyond India and beyond, I think Quad, maybe there are other players, and if I could point to them, because I tend to look at the Indian Ocean on a little more wider, is for the United States, UAE. You just mentioned UAE as major development defense partner. So UAE borders the Indian Ocean region. It has a lot of engagement. Can there be partnerships that already exist take on an Indian Ocean engagement and conversation to address these burden sharing and resource constrained conversation? And for Tokyo, I would say France. I mean, France is an Indian Ocean player regardless. Whether anybody engages with them or not, they are there, especially on the Western Indian Ocean. The problem, I think, is in our mental framing as well. And one of the issues that I faced in Washington is that France is a transatlantic ally, so you don't hear of them as Indo-Pacific, but doesn't mean that they don't exist or they don't operate there. So I think in our own Indo-Pacific mappings, that could be something perhaps could be helpful for Washington and Tokyo to go. Should there come a time when your key players in the region gets occupied by other developments in their immediate region, like for India in South Asia? So I think that's something that can be that we can discuss. Yeah.
Just to add on that, the United States does cooperation, as you know very well, with France, with the United Kingdom, but a lot of that is done in the Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific, not in the Indian Ocean. We've got the Partners in the Blue Pacific Initiative, which has helped to bring some of America's transatlantic allies into deeper coordination with us on the Pacific. They, of course, London and Paris, have territorial reasons to be particularly interested in the region, as does the United States. But I think you're right that in the Indian Ocean, we haven't talked about this as much. And I think there's a logic for it also from a big picture American standpoint, which is, look, we don't know who's going to win the election here and what exactly their foreign policy might be, but it is possible that you will get an administration here that says, look, we just can't do quite as much in the Middle East as we've been doing. And the US may have to rely on other allies and partners to step up and do more. And that will have some effect on the Indian Ocean. And I don't think we've fully worked through exactly how important it might be if, let's say, the US has less of a presence in the Persian Gulf. Less of a presence in the Red Sea. That will alter American engagement, not just in the Middle East, but also in the Indian Ocean. And it may make some of those other players even more important.
Absolutely. I think I'll open it up for questions from the floor. If anyone's got a question, please raise your hand and find a mic. Olivia, I'll go with this mic.
Okay. Hello, I'm Oliver Blarrell. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment in the Europe program. And it's almost where we ended up, so it'll be a very fluid transition. Well, you talked about France, but I think you can even go beyond and talk about the European Union. Is that for the US, of course, that's a continuing question, but also for Japan, is it the conversation that, does it perceive in the Indian Ocean, where it's basically the entry point for the Europe in the Indo-Pacific, is the European Union or Europe, with UK included, part of the scenery when it comes to the Indian Ocean? So this is my question.
I think Zack has already mentioned that free and open Indo-Pacific has become the concept which has a gravity that everybody wish to subscribe to whenever they try to develop its wider region policy. Indo-Pacific has become the iconic concept, and that is also true for the Europe, starting from the UK, Netherlands, Germany, France, but also EU has its own Indo-Pacific components of how they try to factor in to the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific as a concept. And Zack mentioned about it, it has its own strategic and territorial interests, especially in the Southern Pacific islands for France and British port to some extent. But I think that, distribution of the power that is happening in 2020 and 30s, definitely those emerging states resides in the Indo-Pacific, and for the future strategy that there has been a consistent European interest to be incorporated into the dynamics. So these are, I think, a basic platform to be seen. But I guess recently I have been finding some types of the reviewing in the debates in some parts in the European states. Look at new government in UK, and they have been reviewing the previous concept of the Indo-Pacific tilt by the former government, and then try to focus on the more transatlantic component of the resource allocation. The same, I think, pattern of the thoughts that Zack has described for the United States. What if that there will be the major war with Russia in next 5 to 10 years in the European theater? Would that Europe will remain in the Indo-Pacific players? And I think the priority will be dramatically will be shifted. So that I think that will be pretty much event-driven. What could be the developments of the Ukraine war and the Middle East, and then also in the war in the Pacific. And if that kind of things could be, intertwined but managed, not really going into the major crisis, Indo-Pacific remains to be the major concept of the play for the European states. But I think that will be pretty much jeopardized with the situation arises.
I'll just build really quickly on Ken's point and note that I think from an American standpoint, cooperation with Europe broadly in the rest of the world is critical, but I think the format is going to be different. A lot of the transatlantic relationship is US-EU or US in NATO. I'm not sure that either of those is the right format for engagement in the Indian Ocean. I used to work at NATO for a little bit. NATO is a great organization, but its charter is focused on the Euro-Atlantic area. And as you know well, the EU has its hands full, both inside Europe and also dealing with the challenge from Russia. I think in many ways it's easier for the US to deal with individual European member states right now on Indian Ocean or Pacific issues. And I think we'll see that more and more. This may be cooperation with the US and the UK or US, Japan, UK. That may be easier than doing something with Europe as a whole or NATO as a whole.
Thank you. There's one more question here.
Hi, my name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. Interesting, I didn't expect if we had asked a representative from US Congress and the White House, you wouldn't play out all the options as Mr. Zack and as you did. I would take off my naturalized US citizen hat and throw it away and get back my Indian citizenship. I was born there. So I'll talk from that perspective. Actually, India and Japan, after the Second World War has tried to come closer a number of times. And the reason it went rocky because US has a long umbilical cord on Japan, which it pulls. So given that, what I would like to see is a Japan-India military alliance clearly focused on China, and then decide how much in Indian Ocean, how much and if China attacks Japan, we are involved in the war, and if China attacks India, Japan and India is both equally involved, and lays out the scenario. That's what would work, and US will not pull the umbilical cord on that. That should be an agreement.
That's a great concept, and I wish that could happen. I think that there has been the developments of the mill-to-mill relationship between Japan and India in many perspectives, and we are ready to upgrade the relationship. But I think that the security system that we developed after the end of the World War II is based on the hub and spoke system. We do have a mutual defense
commitment with the United States individually, but not among those allies. And there's a certain reason for that. For example, Japan and Korea recently have, developed its own relationship, taking the full advantage of the political confidence that we have. But whether Korea wished Japan to send a self-defense force to Korean Peninsula is a very much sensitive agenda because of the history that will be associated. And that could be true for Philippines, and that could be true for other allies. And we do. India, okay, so that's great. That's a great encouragement that you raised. We are happy if India forces will come to help us when we were attacked by the adversaries. But are we ready to send our self-defense forces to Pakistan border, for example, or to Himalaya to fight together with Indian forces to China? And I think that that kind of the mutual, investments for the future, common strategic concerns needs to be discussed. But I think that has to be developed on the practical basis. And I think for Japan-India cooperation, the best practices of the mill-to-mill cooperation could be developed in the maritime domain, and also especially in the Indian Ocean, but also in the wider sea lanes of communication.
And I'll just add an Indian perspective to it. And, I think Japan would be, like Ken said, I think Japan would probably be more open to something like that in terms of even within Quad. I think the hesitation is in Delhi. Delhi, it's not about US or Japan. Delhi doesn't have a mutual defense treaty with anybody in the world. So I think it's less to do with sort of umbilical cord or the relationship between US and Japan, and more to do with the comfort levels of Delhi, and it makes sense. I mean, Delhi's had a very different history than any of the other partners in the Quad or around. So, but I think what I like about the Quad is essentially the way I'm beginning to see it is it's perhaps a new precedent or a framework or framing in which you'll see partners who are not treaty allies coming together on shared concerns and really stepping up on very critical issues which traditionally were reserved only for treaty alliances. And we are seeing Quad take on very, very sensitive, critical aspects of strategic conversations that almost did not exist out of treaty alliances, right? So I think it creates precedents for even other partners who might not have treaty alliances, but over time may be forced to have a better relationship. So I think that could be another and a new model, and that maybe Quad's leading the path for it. We are almost at time, but one final question to the both of you. I'm just taking the chair's prerogative here and say any final thoughts, but also change of leadership in DC and Tokyo, and what that is going to mean for the region, for Washington, for Japan, and also since we are looking at an absolutely new leadership in Tokyo. So any reflections on that as we close out the session?
Yeah, since it's only 5 hours after the election results, but I guess that one of the safest way that I could provide is that there should be more continuity than the changes. It's eventually the election of the LDP, who shares the basic lines of policy that they want to pursue. And also we were surrounded by, very severe security environment, and the track records of the releasing of the strategy document needs to be implemented. Whoever becomes the prime minister, we really need to allocate our resources into the direction that we have decided. And I think that will also be pursued by the incoming Prime Minister Ishiba. And something to do with what the Darshana mentioned, was how does he see the regional security networks is something, the agenda that I'm very curious to see, because Ishiba has been mentioning about the deepening of the regional ties, and that could be equivalent to the so-called the Asian version of NATO, which I don't believe that is the case in Asia at all. But I think that his intention is to deepen the coalition among those U.S. allies and partners in much more practical manner. If that is the direction that he wished to pursue, there should be a more potential that the new government will look into the Indian Ocean in a much more strategic sense, and also bringing in India as a more institutionally, deepened strategic partner for Japan.
Well, I think Ken's comment about continuity applies also to Washington. Look, there's some huge differences between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. I don't think I need to belabor that point. But the least different policy approaches are probably on Japan and India. Biden has been a huge supporter of India and of Japan. Trump was also. And so if you had to pick two countries around the world that have had actually a pretty easy US bilateral relationship over the last decade, I'd put Japan and India right at the top. And I don't think that's going to change. I imagine if Donald Trump wins the election, he'll be pretty excited about going to a Quad meeting in India next year. He loved engaging with Modi directly in the Howdy Modi events here in the United States. I think he and Ishiba will have to take some time to get to know one another, but the US-Japan alliance is in very good shape. And Kamala Harris, Indian American, so that I think would be a natural partnership. And she knows Japanese leadership quite well already. And so, in a striking way, actually the United States, Japan, and India are being pulled together by the strategic logic of our interests. And I think that will overcome any challenges that we might have in terms of personnel changes in any of the three capitals.
Fantastic. On that very positive note, thank you both so much. Please join me in thanking the two speakers and for joining us today, this afternoon. We also have some lunch after this, so I hope you'll stay on and continue engaging and continuing the conversations. Thank you all for coming so much.